All right, guys. So I've recently read From Dictatorship to Democracy, Conceptual Framework for Liberation, 4th U.S. edition by Gene Sharp, as presented by the Albert Einstein Institution. And I think this is an excellent textbook, which is very relevant to the entire world, particularly the United States today. Uh, it is specifically about Democrats who want to change their societies into democracies. So it's about not the party of Democrats here in the United States, but it's about the people who want to, who intend to participate in a democracy. Those are Democrats. So, you know, the majority of Americans would fall into this definition. Uh, if you want to participate in democracy, if you want democracy, you are a Democrat. And that doesn't mean your political party. That's just what that word means. That is what that word means, and that's how this book uses it. So we're going to go into this book over probably very many episodes because I think it's full of a lot of wisdom. And, you know, let's get started. We're going to go straight to page 4 after the preface into the meat of the text. Now, at this point in the text, Gene Sharp has described several dictatorships around the world and the ways the people who live with them suffer, and the ways Democrats have attempted to convert these societies to democracies and have often failed. And in the light of the abuses of corrupt governments and failed attempts at democracy, it is often obvious. The obvious question is often, do we resort to violence? Do we attempt to achieve our freedom through violence? And to answer that question, Gene Sharp says, very probably not. He says, of people who have tried to use violence to convert dictatorship to democracy, these people have often fought bravely at great cost in suffering and lives. Their accomplishments have sometimes been remarkable, but they rarely have won freedom. Violent rebellions can trigger brutal repression that frequently leaves the populace more helpless than before. So the primary issue is when you choose to use violence to achieve democracy, it often creates much more violence than anyone intends. And this does not create a situation that is conducive to a democratic society. You don't have, you know, excess violence in a democratic society. Furthermore, anyone who's read Sun Tzu's Art of War will easily understand the next concept that Gene Sharp explains. He says, by placing confidence in violent means, one has chosen the very type of struggle with which the oppressors nearly always have superiority. So, as I said, Sun Tzu's Art of War, he would recommend, and really anyone with a sound strategic mind should recommend, that you do not attempt to achieve victory by challenging your opponent at their strongest or in their most advantaged position. And by using violence, by choosing use violence, convert dictatorship to democracy, you are almost surely doing exactly that, because the government exists as an entity that has a monopoly on violence, which is provided to them by the consent of the police and the military. Um, it is, as Gene Sharp indicates, extremely unlikely that Democrats within a dictatorship are going to have access to the means of overcoming this disparity in ability to use violence. And so, anticipating what some people might suggest, given the case that a violent revolution is not the way, they may say a specific kind of violence is preferable and may be useful, and that is guerrilla warfare. Gene Sharp, however, goes on to say guerrilla warfare rarely, if ever, benefits the oppressed population or ushers in a democracy. Guerrilla warfare is no obvious solution, particularly given the very strong tendency toward immense casualties among one's own people. The technique is no guarantor against failure, despite supporting theory and strategic analysis and sometimes international backing. So, what he's saying here is guerrilla warfare is a good way to be a pain in your opponent's ass. However, this means that you're going to experience a drawn out conflict. And because you're experiencing a drawn out conflict against an opponent who likely has a monopoly on violence, then you are also going to experience immense casualties among your own people. This is the cost of guerrilla warfare in the case of a much weaker group versus a police and military state. And the fourth and final warning Gene Sharp issues against considering violence or using violence to convert dictatorship to democracy is that the removal of particular persons and cliques from the governing position most likely will merely make it possible for another group to take their place. After consolidating its position, the new clique may turn out to be more ruthless and more ambitious than the old one. Consequently, the new clique, in which hopes may have been placed, will be able to do whatever it wants without concern for democracy or human rights. That is not an acceptable answer to the problem of dictatorship. And so, to explain in perhaps more plain language, Sharp suggests that if one chooses to use violence as a means to convert dictatorship to democracy, then one is creating a culture of violence. The Democrats who are given offices to represent and organize the democracy, who chose to use violence to get there, may be threatened by violence because of the culture they created on their way into power. This use of violence is a black pill for one's culture. So, in summary, the use of violence in revolution, use of violence in converting dictatorship to democracy is unfortunately sometimes unavoidable. However, it should be avoided as often as possible because the cost is almost certain to be much greater than anyone intends. And the consequences of even victorious violence may be just as bad or worse than the dictatorship in the first place.